I once took a trip across the Eurasian steppes. Why would I go to such a place? A place in which virtually no one lives, visits. It hasn't produced the great cities in history that many places have. It is a prohibitive place, many would say absent of any beauty. But I had to understand this place better. It had been forgotten in history as a nearly continuous flat grassland a few thousand miles long or several thousand kilometers and fairly narrow. What has it done? Why is it important? Why did I want to understand it? It is our homeland and the place our languages come from. 70% of the world's population has strong ancestral ties to this region, and over 90% have at least some ancestral ties to it. This grassland extends from Eastern Europe to Manchuria in northeastern China. Even today, it produces nomadic pastoralists who roam its vastness of extreme cold and wind, just as has been done for thousands of years. This is where the horse was first domesticated a few thousand years ago. In the last episode, I talked about proto-languages. These exist in theory as to what a current language has been developed from, or parent languages. Most of the world's population speaks languages that have their proto-language on the Eurasian steppes. This includes the proto-language of Indo-European, which virtually all European languages, most of the languages of India, the main languages of Iran and Pakistan, and many others come from. Other proto-languages from the Eurasian steppes include the parent languages of those spoken by most Chinese, Native Americans, Japanese, Koreans, Turks, Mongols, and quite a number of others. In this series, I intend to break down the origins of all the major languages. In the first episode, I began describing how Greek is derived from Indo-European, and that its early speakers made some of the most profound of academic discoveries. I continue with that in this episode and move on to some of the other Indo-European languages, including Latin. Alexander the Great was Aristotle's student. Alexander and his armies quickly conquered parts of Eastern Europe, the Persian Empire, most of the Middle East, most of the Central Asian countries, out to the edge of China, and part of India. Alexander died at the age of 32, and his generals quickly grabbed what they could of the empire, and decades of wars among themselves pursued. The Seleucid Empire and Alexandria were formed in this way and became two of the greatest intellectual centers in history. As these conquerors were Greek, Greek became these lands' state language. Alexandria was on what is now the north coast of Egypt. It would last about 300 years under the rule of Ptolemy and his descendants. The well-known Cleopatra was one of these. I believe the first 100 years of Alexandria was the most academic place in history, with more fundamental discoveries than at any other time. It was the place that wished to know everything. This was the place of academic giants, such as Archimedes, Euclid, Aristophanes, Aristarchus, Eratosthenes, Callimachus, and Apollonius. Later there was Hypatia and Galen. Many others made it to the Library of Alexandria, whose goal was to contain every originally written informational book or document on the face of the earth. I've done past episodes on Alexandria. The Seleucid Empire controlled the area of Asia that Alexander had conquered. Many great cities were created under it. Greeks were encouraged to settle there, and Greek was adopted as the state language. The Seleucid Empire would last for about 250 years. However, the eastern half would be lost to the Parthians an Iranian people, and the Far East would be made into the Greco-Bactrian kingdom and later the Indo-Greek kingdom, offshoots of the Seleucid Empire. For nearly 350 years, Greek rulers would rule over what is now northern Afghanistan, all of Pakistan, northwestern India, and other areas. For about 100 years, these kingdoms ruled over parts of Iran, but a lesser time over all of Iran. Many Greeks would move to India and become Buddhist monks. Since a couple hundred years before Alexander invaded this area, Greeks had been settling there. The Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms would both over time adopt Buddhism. Buddhist art and Buddhist philosophy of China, Japan, and Korea is thought to come from this. The Indo-Greek kingdom would shift somewhat south, more strongly into northern India, while maintaining its presence in Afghanistan. This happened in 200 BC. This lasted until 10 AD. The kings here combined Greek and Indian ideas. Many people of Afghanistan have light-colored eyes. It is believed that this is from the long-time Greek presence here. Ashoka the Great, who united and ruled India in the 3rd century BCE, was thought to be partially Greek from his mother's side. Greeks would maintain their language and at least some cultural identity for about 1,000 years in this region. During this time, some Greek words crept into the local languages. The Roman Emperor Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, or what is today Istanbul, in the year 330 CE. He felt it was more beneficial to have the center of the empire in the east, which was more culturally and economically developed than in the west. Also, Christianity, the faith he embraced, was more developed in the east than in the west at that time. This then became known as Byzantium, or the Eastern Roman Empire, and would last more than 1,100 years until the year 1453. The new capital was in a Greek-speaking region. In the 7th century, Greek became the official language of Byzantium and would remain so for the last 800 years of the empire. Western schools since the Renaissance have embraced a classical education based on Greek and Latin ideas for learning. This has been the case in primary, secondary, and college levels. Over the last few decades, it has not been as common. It often would have included learning Latin or Greek. Then being able to read the ancient literature of both languages in their original form, but also learning their history and philosophy. One branch that split off from the Indo-Europeans would make it to Anatolia, or what is present-day Turkey. This was around 4400 to 4100 BCE. The first powerful empire from the Indo-Europeans were the Hittites, who were descendants of these Anatolians and spoke an Anatolian language. They began sometime before 1750 BCE in the middle of Anatolia. They were the first to use chariots for war. About 1350 BCE, they would reach their peak. They then controlled the eastern 2/3 of Turkey and significant parts of Lebanon and Syria. Around the year 1100 BCE, they would split into several independent kingdoms. This would last for about 300 years until they were defeated by the Assyrian Empire. The prophet Abraham has a contested birthplace. Muslim scholars I have encountered or read about believe he was born in Urfa, or more formally, Sanli-Urfa, which is a city on the Turkish-Syrian border today. Christian scholars believe he was born in the city of Ur, in what is southern Iraq. The Muslim scholars I have spoken to have a stronger belief that Abraham was born in Urfa than the Christian scholars have about him being born in Ur. The Christian scholars only cite what they have read. The Muslim scholars have more evidence. I am wondering if there was any influence on Abraham from the religions that preceded Hinduism. If Abraham had been born in Urfa, I believe he would have spoken, or at least been exposed to, an Anatolian language, which had separated from the Indo-Aryans, an offshoot of Indo-European not so long before. The Indo-Aryans went on to form Hinduism around the same time. If Abraham was born in Ur, he may have been exposed to a group of Indo-Aryans who left the main Indo-Aryans directly and moved through Iraq. The Proto-Celtic language broke from Indo-European and was spoken from about 1200 BCE to 900 BCE. Then it splintered into a number of languages covering much of Central Europe and the British Isles. Today, there are only a few Celtic languages left and are quickly dying out. Most of them survive in the British Isles, and at least one survives in the Brittany area of France. Italic is the mother of the Romance languages, or Latin, Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian, and others. Proto-Italic was spoken around 1700 BCE. It is thought a few hundred years later, these people crossed the Alps, split into different groups, and formed different Italic languages. Little is known about Rome before the 6th century BCE, but for at least a couple hundred years, it existed as a kingdom. This kingdom spoke Old Latin. Beginning in the 6th century BCE, they would start expanding. They would not expand beyond present-day Italy until the 3rd century BCE, and in the same century finally defeated the Etruscan people to the north, which had been the powerful state in Italy for some time before this. The Etruscans were not an Italic people. The Roman Empire grew, and Latin displaced many of the Celtic languages, as well as the other Italic. Classical Latin was spoken from 75 BCE until the 3rd century CE. Latin classical studies, even until today, include studying the works of Cicero, Seneca, Epictetus, Pliny the Elder, Marcus Aurelius, Virgil, and others. The Western Roman Empire especially moved away from the classical Latin after Rome fell in the 5th century CE. When Rome fell, so did the classical education, which had been developed. The result of this was a period called the Dark Ages, as Europe then fell behind, a period of almost no advances, and in many areas, a reverse of understanding. The Arab world, or the Middle East, did maintain classical education during this time, and preserved many of the classical works. The Dark Ages of Europe would last several hundred years, until the last years of the 13th century. A change then came as to the importance of a solid education. This was from the humanist movement, which led to the European Renaissance. Ever since, classical education has been common in the West. A Latin education would include becoming proficient in classical Latin and reading the text from the time of the Roman Empire. This includes its literature, culture, history, politics, philosophers, and focus on rhetoric. From Latin would come Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and others. Each of these languages often had dozens of closely related languages. Thank you so much for watching, and please come along as we continue to explore the history of the world's languages. Have a great day, and see you in the next episode.